Hello, my name is Jason Reichl, and you're listening to Risk Management Brick by Brick. I'm fascinated with people who are helping build and maintain the physical world around us. On each episode of this podcast, we'll dive in with a risk manager, speak to them about how technology plays a role in this process.
Adrian, thank you for joining me on Brick by Brick. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Jason, pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me. My name is Adrian Pellen. I lead NFP's construction and infrastructure team across the U.S. and Canada, currently based in Chicago, a city I love near and dear. In my career, I've spent just about 20 years in the space. Worked for a number of other large brokers, and a focus area for us is the construction infrastructure sector. We work with contractors and owner-developers and other stakeholders with their risk and insurance needs. Big focus for me right now is really leading with risk controls. So what are the contractual, technology, and operational controls that companies, clients, and other risk stakeholders can put in place to help either A, mitigate risk, but also the consequential impacts of reducing premiums?
How is that different than what other brokerages were doing 10 or 15 years ago? Like, what does that actually mean when you do that for a customer?
That's a great question. So, even if we look, we're here at the IRMI conference and walking the floor, we just did a session on builder's risk that I moderated. And in addition to the audience members focused as risk buyers or risk advisors, there were a number of technology companies present. And just walking the IRMI floor, there's Brick Guy and a number of other companies focusing on devices or project management software. So I feel like we're really at an inflection point around that aspect of the industry. Technology is not new. However, we're seeing real proliferation of it applied to job sites, and every asset class could be commercial construction. We're seeing even infrastructure. Historically, the industry's always been focused on risk controls, but it's really been driven around, hey, what's in the contract? If you're a contractor,
Mitigation transfer was pretty...
Exactly, right? And then it's, hey, from a safety perspective, just traditional engineering. But this is a bit of a different paradigm shift. So that's what I see as really being different.
Do you think that's because, and you can tell me this because you're closer to it, is that because there's less jobs being produced? Is that because the precision on jobs have increased so much that you can't just mitigate it? Because if you mitigated everything, you wouldn't have any work to be done.
Yeah.
Why has the industry gone so much in the opposite direction where it's just we have to take on more risks as the business ourselves?
Yeah.
And we have to have other methods for overcoming that.
Well, I'll talk about my own personal view, and then I have a lens based on just what's going on in the industry from third-party incredible sources. But I look at it, from my own view, I have a personal commitment and belief and value that you got to be figuring out ways to continually improve. That's a strong core belief that I hold. If I look at the construction industry and a number of reports that have come out from folks like McKinsey, they just updated a report from 5 years ago to this past August and basically said the state of the construction industry is really poor in the context of productivity growth, right? So largely how many contractors compete is on price. And of course, there's brand and other aspects, but price is the leading indicator of whether or not they're going to win a job. Technical, depending on the type of work, could be, as low as 10% of the overall rating scheme.
Yeah.
Insurance is not dissimilar. I mean, we've got a way to go in the productivity sector or component as well. But I think that's really a massive driver, right? There was a similar study done up in Canada with Toronto Dominion Bank saying it's a huge lag and it can really jeopardize the efficiency of the economy. So while there's this focus on tech, is that can be an enabler. We have a labor shortage right now across every industry, right? How do we attract qualified talent's a big problem. How do we complement it with some of these additional technologies? I'm sure we'll get into AI later in the conversation. But when I think about what technology allows us to do, it allows us to be more productive, right? And compete on ways other than price to really drive more efficiency. If you're a contractor, to shrink the schedule of a project, just to be more accurate, I think is a better way of looking at it.
I also like the idea that if you're going to have to win on price, you're going to have to lower your price. So you're going to have to figure out new ways to be more effective and efficient to make the margin, right? As long as the organizations can make the margin, then the business can continue to grow. But a lot of the old paradigms, I mean, I totally agree with you. It has a lot to do with after COVID, a lot of the trade professions didn't come back in. And you had a lot of, I would call them middle seniority people now taking leadership roles who didn't have a full picture of what was needing to be done. One thing I wanted to do is I do want to talk about AI a little bit. And more so, I was at ITC last week, 2 weeks ago. And when I was at ITC, something that really was interesting to me is the idea that the insurance industry, which is primarily based on historical records, and you have all of these people who look at these to build the models, build the services, But now AI is coming in and you have this data that's more real time than ever. And the insurance industry seems like it's going through an inflection point of how do we price product? How do we make ourselves more competitive in the moment? And then when we're wrong about it, because we might be, because this is a brand new world, how do we make sure we still build books of businesses that are successful for us? Now, really isn't about risk, but how does having access to that data for all of those different models, for the way that NFP thinks, how does that shape the next 5 years?
Yeah, that's a great question. So maybe I can give a personal point of view. I think the way that I look at it is I'm very humbled by a lot of the people that I've worked with throughout my career, and particularly now, even at NFP. I mean, we've most recently brought on a former chief technology officer from a construction company. We've got data scientists and engineers on staff. I look at where my success and true differentiators, I look at myself as an integrator of business, right? And I try to figure out how do we take all these very complex issues, pull them together, and then still make sure that we're delivering, the fundamentals of the business. My own view is really, to use the words I use, at an inflection point. And when I look at data, and particularly how the application for AI, I think the biggest challenge we have both in construction and the insurance sector is it's kind of dislocated. It's in different parts. I think many stakeholders across the industry, whether in construction or another area, are trying to get their data house in order through RMIS systems or RMIS providers. But the big issue I still have found is that those don't really do a good job of matching kind of the front-end accounting information. So I look at it like a journey, and I believe in this concept called incremental innovation. I think you've got, 4 or 5 years out where we need to be. I think, AI will be a huge component of reviewing policy forms and exposures in the front end and helping streamline that. But like anything, it's still very much an art. And that's where I think, tremendous value will be available. But on the data side, people have to match exposure information to losses. And I think that's the fundamental first step to really have the appropriate insights.
One thing that I'm talking to risk managers about is I have a lot of access to carriers and talking to them. And carriers, modern carriers who I consider are looking for new ways to be competitive and price themselves appropriately, and maybe even have some relationship with the insured directly, right? And not only going through brokers. They're often talking now about these models where, hey, maybe the COI, which we thought was not really anything, it's just a proof of that you read the contract. It's actually a leading indicator of if people are going to be good partners of yours. So when companies try to insure these guys and they can look at their COI record and go, hey, you only have a 35% compliant. In the construction industry, most are at 60%, so you're not meeting that. That's a good indicator that the companies they work with are more risky. And I think before, that was information that no one really understood how to actualize and put it into a model, right? So it's kind of like that band thing where I think Motley Crue only asked for yellow M&Ms, or like, oh, that's because you're divas. And they're like, no. We have a drum set that flips upside down. If they can't read the contract about the yellow M&Ms, then we're not going to have our drummer get on this thing and have it flip upside down, right? So it was like a proof point. And I think that's really interesting that some of these mechanisms that the industry never actually meant to have be checks and balances are now being put into models to predict risk.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Jason, that's an excellent point. And I think we describe with COI compliance as a proxy for sound management, right? And we see that apply in other areas of the industry. There are a number of insurance companies that are evaluating new technologies. Project management software is a great one. I know there are Procore and Raiken, Autodesk, and others, and a number of insurers in particular are very focused on that. But they're willing to make the bet that, hey, if they are great users of these products and are deploying them in the most appropriate way, that's a proxy for good management, which is a proxy for good risk management. So I would absolutely agree with you that that's really where the industry's headed.
Where is the broker's relationship as a technologist? Do you feel like the next generation of brokers are going to have to be better technologists?
Yeah, that's a great question. The way that I really think about it is one of two ways. I think from my point of view, when you work with large, sophisticated, whether it's a contractor or developer or other stakeholder, right? If it's a corporate where they've got, the ability to invest in folks who understand technology, participate in things like ITC if they're in that space or other areas. Absolutely. I think that is where they probably have a bit more fluency in doing it in-house. I think and this is a story we take our clients on, I kind of look at it as a bit of a dichotomy between, particularly for contractors that we work with, you're either a technology adopter, right? You're an early adopter or entrenched. How do we help you rationalize that and then communicate and measure how you're mitigating risk, but also how we work with insurers to demonstrate the same and get the appropriate credits for it. Then there are those that we call a tech FOMO story arc. And that is where, hey, we don't have technology. Those are others, whether based on size or scale, are relevant. Even smaller companies are really looking at ways to do it. So the role, I think, for the brokers really help them understand, not necessarily to implement all the variety of technology, but to distill based on what we're observing with the insurers, which mitigates risks, where are we seeing the ability to help them really determine the overall value of implementing a technology. So that is a big part of it. And I think given my earlier comments around productivity being a huge issue, companies that don't start to adopt technology are going to remain less productive, and they're going to have a more difficulty competing on price compared to others who are early adopters.
Obviously, when you're a broker, you work with usually a certain set of carriers that you work with policies on. So you guys aren't completely objective. Someone coming to NFP knows, okay, they're probably going to put us here or here with maybe a handful of different carriers. How do you think brokers, should they have a technology suite they recommend, or is it important for brokers to be objective to the business? What's more helpful to business, having a clear technology strategy for them, or saying, oh yeah, okay, we understand you have a RMIS system, but I don't really know yours, so I can't really help you there. Do you feel like you guys need to be carving out a technology landscape for your customers?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really where the trends are headed. I think there's an increasing expectation that not only can we go into markets and get terms and deliver policies and provide day-to-day service for a whole variety of needs, it's how do we help them navigate, the issues to be a better risk. And technology is a big part of that, whether it's what I'll call data architecture tech, like a RMIS, or things that get installed on the project side, or even enterprise software. It's a complex issue. Ultimately, I think it's require partnerships, not just on the broker side, partnership with insurers, partnership with the actual vendors supplying the tech. I think consultants play a role as well. So it's a complex, element. I think we're investing in this space. I think we want to be really, as best we can be, cutting edge and making sure that we're able to really, really lead clients down this pathway.
I'd probably be amiss if I didn't talk about Aon and NFP. What's going on there? How's that?
It's certainly been a great opportunity for me on a personal level. I've worked at Aon previously, and then moved over to Marsh, and now back at NFP. What I can say is that we're working as an independent and connected company, and that's allowed us to continue on with our current strategy, which is my focus is North American construction and infrastructure business across a variety of stakeholders. Aon's actually been an enabler of growth. They've continued to invest in our team at NFP, both in the U.S. and Canada, but also provide access a number of additional tools, just given their scale, complexity, and history that we haven't necessarily had access to before. So for me, it's been a real compliment to what we're doing.
Have most of your customers viewed it that way as well?
Yeah, I'd say so. I mean, a lot of customers that I think the perception may have been, hey, they picked NFP for a reason. Being perhaps viewed as a bit more nimbler at the time, it's been a great compliment. There have been a number of areas where we're collaborating actively with Aon to access some of their services. But also, we still maintain our independence, and, we've got our own strategies. But at the same time, we're really trying to make sure that we're bringing equally the value proposition of both companies to bear for clients.
I want to put you on the spot, and if you don't want to answer this, it's totally understandable. But with the election just a few days away,
yeah.
What does that mean to the infrastructure of construction?
So, great question. And I'm going to respond to this in a way because I'm Canadian. So, while I hold a green card here and my wife's American, I can kind of, weigh in unencumbered without getting into any, political beliefs. But I think both are promising. Right now we've had a number of acts passed under the Biden administration that even I know Trump was trying to get done during his previous term. I was very excited when Trump came in. I was even very fortunate enough to have an invitation to the White House at the time to talk through, the priorities of infrastructure spending and how they can reduce some of the red tape around approvals to get money to market faster. Well, here we are, nearly 8 years later, and money's hitting the street, right? We've got $60 billion in railway funds that, we're very active in the New York market, a lot of tunneling projects supporting rail infrastructure. We've seen the CHIPS Act pass, so that was really designed around how do we create more self-sufficiency around semiconductors. That's not going anywhere, right? I think regardless of the administration, and we're seeing renewable energy. Now, regardless of, I'd say one side of the house policy is more favorable to perhaps conventional energy. Regardless of that, because of AI, we've got such high energy demands. I'm not again, I'm not an economist around the energy sector, but I think regardless of that, we're still going to need to see traditional energy sources be promoted along with renewable energy and now even nuclear. So I think regardless of that outcome, I'm very bullish around infrastructure. We've got stimulus in place. The other thing is really around the Fed. The administration doesn't necessarily directly control the Fed, but we've seen, reduction in interest rates. My hope is that will start to be a great paradigm for it. We've already got the stimulus hitting the street. Now we've got monetary policy that will help support additional development. So I'm very bullish overall, candidly, regardless of who's in control on the construction sector.
So let's talk about something then. If infrastructure is not going to dip, which I don't think it is, I totally agree with you. I feel like both administrations understand that infrastructure is critical to the future success of America. What are you doing in order to help your insured deal with the fact that they have a crisis of talent, that they might not be able to do these kinds of projects now that stimulus is hitting the marketplace? We need to hire people, subcontractors. Are you recommending subcontractors? Are you recommending your clients take more of that in-house? Like, how are you diversifying their risk?
Yeah, well, that's a complex question. What I would say is there's a number of different ways we really approach, and I'll bring it back to this concept of being a risk control driven broker advisor, right? So whatever's trying to get accomplished, how do we help them bring it to market? So part of that is, hey, how expensive is the cost of risk relative to other components of the project? Areas in New York now are 10, 11, 12%, especially in complicated tunnel projects, which are very active in the moment. We're even seeing cost escalation in Canada. As someone who's historically from Canada, the rates there were 50 bips on a percentage of CV. Now we're seeing 1.2, 3% in some cases. So that's material. And I think when that level of materiality is in place, it can jeopardize the bankability of projects, regardless of how much stimulus funding is in place. So the way that we really try to look at the lens is, again, how do we help structure and support the transaction to ultimately reduce the cost of risk? And that's not only just buying insurance, and maybe, hey, getting the data house in order. I'm a big believer in kind of Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule. What are your top 5 risks on the project overall, regardless of coverage line? Let's spend your efforts there contractually from an operational risk control perspective. And then, hey, coincidentally, what's the technology that's out there that we can introduce to you that we can maybe help reduce the cost, right? So that's really how we try to approach things systematically.
And are you seeing owners of the builds, those people caring more about having visibility into the risk profile of who they hire?
Absolutely. I think that's a big process. Certainly on government projects, there's a huge qualification procedure where they want a statement of qualifications from a variety of bidders, whether it's singular or joint venture on other projects, track records in the jurisdiction, even down to the individual engineers, lead engineers on a project. When it's non-infrastructure, we're still seeing that level of focus. But I do think, just given where we are with the economy and having a labor, shortage, particularly for trades, you're taking on more and more work. And I know a number of folks in the surety sector and then subcontractor default are watching this very closely. It's not so much when there's not enough work, it's when there's too much work where we start to see defaults on performance.
And more risk go up, is right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
What are some common misconceptions about construction risk management that you often encounter and want to debunk? What is the old paradigm that you still see run rampant that you're like, that doesn't matter, this is what you should be focused on?
Yeah, I'd say, it probably is in the role of both. The role of the risk advisor, right? And it was just broker. You go to market, go get the insurance terms, come back. And of course, brokers throughout history prided themselves in not being transactional. I think being fluid transactionally is just required. I think we're seeing especially sophisticated clients build out their own brokerages because sometimes they think they can and do it better, and sometimes they can't, right? They know their business better than anyone. So then it becomes really much more advisory based, right? And I think we've seen a lot, even in companies, changing of the risk manager role to be less insurance and more on enterprise risk, even in weighing into issues around personnel, and similar in the brokerage side. So it requires a much more holistic view of business and not just insurance.
Yeah, a trend we see is that the risk management team is being brought in selection, they're being brought in onboarding, and they're doing their risk assessment before they even narrow down the potential people who they're going to subcontract the work to. Obviously, that's not new, but them doing it as a proactive process in the beginning is something that's new. We're seeing a lot of our tools, and our customers ask us to build tools that analyze intake forms and tell them, okay, who has the best risk? Use things like at trust layer, the trust layer network, to understand if this subcontractor has met insurance stuff at other vendors, right? So there's really a world we're about to move into where you get it when you come to events like this or ITC or anywhere where there's actually risk managers, RIMs, that these people love sharing information to make the entire industry better. But now the technology is sort of catching up to that, where they're creating a network effect where, if I'm a construction company in Tennessee, we are now able to surface to them, here's what most construction companies in Tennessee are asking for. What you're asking for is maybe too rigid. Maybe you're not asking for enough. Are you doing that to win business? Are you doing that because you don't know, right? And we're talking more mid-market here, not probably infrastructure deals. But I think that if that mid-market can be educated and become more understanding of the value of the risk management to business as a mechanism for creating velocity within your business, I think that that's going to go all the way up, obviously, to where infrastructure companies and things like that are already probably thinking about those things. What's an area that is emerging right now that you're trying to wrap your hands around about how do you guys bring products to that industry?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I've talked a little bit about technology. So, not to spend too much more time, but we've obviously seen the emergence of insurers either giving rate and deductible credits for the deployment of certain tech, but conversely, a number of insurers are also providing the technologies as part of the premium. So that's an interesting one. I think we're going to continue to see that, really emerge. I think the complexity for clients is understanding, the landscape of technology changes so rapidly, right? And so what do they need to deploy? So there's really a basis risk on understanding that. I'd say, something else that I really think through around the landscape is really, from a products perspective, is almost just market access, right? So we're sitting here, we're in, San Diego at the moment. There's representation from practically around the globe. We have insurance companies from Asia, we have insurers from Spain and certainly the UK, Canada and the US, of course, and I'm sure many others. It's a global market. And I think from my view as an advisor, we try to find the best talent who understands the risk. So when you have emerging asset classes like, battery energy storage or, mass timber, which has been in place in other jurisdictions, and now the return of nuclear, where is the best underwriting talent? I can tell you there's probably not dozens of nuclear underwriters around the world. There's probably a handful. Mm-hmm. So we spend a lot of time making sure that we're accessing the right place, we're getting the right, advisor or underwriting talent to make sure we're bringing to bear, because there are always inevitably lessons learned from one jurisdiction to another, notwithstanding cultural and, of course, legal nuances.
Do you think that, this is a personal question, we'll end here, but I'm always interested with someone with your varied background and have been doing this for a long time. You still probably have 20 to 40 years in your career, right? What value do you think allows you to stay plugged in and be connected to this? Are you just an insurance nerd? Like what is it that, really motivates you as an individual level?
Yeah, I'd say, there are a couple of core values that I have, and I think, I'm happy to share them. And the number one thing for me is, I'd say trust and transparency. I think if you can't have, maybe even take a step back. I love the underdog story. My own story was one of an underdog, not to share in this podcast per se. Please reach out if you're interested. But, I love that kind of taking the underdog role, and I love building teams. It's a passion of mine to get teams together, and regardless of geography, building out cross-border teams is something I really take pride in. I love to develop folks. And I think one thing that really resonates with me is figuring out ways to have fun, right? And I know in my industry, I'm a relatively intense person at work. Everyone loves to win, but I think having fun with the team and making sure you take the time to do that. And I candidly have been fortunate enough to work with great talent. I mean, I think I'm a leader, but I've been really a function and product of the very talented people I've been able to surround myself in, whether it's in broking or account management or claims or technology and other product lines. So I'd say that's how I really look at it. And then just going out and, just having fun and competing openly, honestly, in this, world of business.
I think one thing I really admire about you that I see constantly is that you have a real deep curiosity about every aspect of the business and how each one kind of is a system, ecosystem onto its own, and it's all working together, And a lot of brokers, they don't have the same opinion of the carriers they work with, or even sometimes they're insured, right? And I think it just comes off in how genuine you are, and also in just how well versed you are at speaking to this subject. So I really appreciate having you on the podcast.
Jason, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, man.
Risk Management Brick by Brick is brought to you by TrustLayer. Find out how TrustLayer manages risk so that the people can build the physical world around us, head over to trustlayer.io. And then make sure to subscribe to Risk Management Brick by Brick on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. On behalf of the TrustLayer team, thank you for listening.